It's our great pleasure today to welcome one of the preeminent historians of the Irish in the West, and indeed the Irish in America, Professor Emeritus David Emmons. His talk today is about his provocative new volume, History's Erratics, Irish Catholic Dissidence and the Transformation of American Capitalism, 1870 to 1930. And he informs me that every word in that title matters a great deal. And so he's going to give us a very thorough explanation. The explanation, the jacket title, the jacket of the book explains the book as follows. As ice age glaciers left behind erratics, so the external forces of history tumbled the Irish into America. Existing both out of time and out of space, a diverse range of these Roman Catholic immigrants saw their new country in a much different way than did the Protestants who settled and claimed it. These erratics chose backward-looking tradition and independence over assimilation, and embraced a quintessentially Irish form of subversiveness that arose from their culture, faith, and working class outlook. David Emmons draws on decades of research and thought to plumb the mismatch of values between, excuse me, let's
Okay, I'll come down.
get everybody muted.
Thanks.
Um, to plumb the mismatch of values between Protestant Americans hostile to Roman Catholicism and the Catholic Irish strangers among them. Joining ethnicity and faith to social class, Emmons explores the unique forms of dissidence that arose when Catholic Irish workers and their sympathizers rejected the beliefs and symbols of American capitalism. A vibrant and original tour de force, History's Erratics explores the ancestral roots of Irish nonconformity and defiance in America. Professor David Emmons is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Montana. His books include two works of essential reading on the topic: The Butte Irish, Class and Ethnicity in an American Mining Town, 1875 to 1925, and Beyond the American Pale, The Irish in the West, 1845 to 1910. Emmons earned his PhD in 1969 from the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he studied under the eminent Western historian from Kremlin, Montana, which I'm sure he'll explain, Robert G. Athern. After 1 year at Eastern Illinois University, he joined the faculty of the history department at the University of Montana in, Dave, was it 1977?
67.
67. And without further ado, I'd like to begin our talk. Dave, I think we agreed we'll lead with the first question. Can you explain your title, History's Erratics?
The title. First of all, I am inordinately proud of that title. I didn't so much find it as it found me, but whatever its origins, it works. Every word of it has a purpose, and so I'm going to go through it word by word, beginning with the metaphorical reference to history and the erratics, and let each word try to amplify some of the basic arguments that I'm trying to make in this book. I would also add as a kind of preliminary that all historians of immigration are fond of metaphors, most of them taken from botany. So we have immigrants uprooted, transplanted, upraised, hybridized. Some are taken from metallurgy. We have immigrants who are put in a melting pot, amalgamated, assimilated, acculturated, Americanized. The problem with each of those metaphors, other than being overdone, is that they suggest that immigrants were profoundly changed by the experience of immigration. A case can be made certainly that they were changed, but whether the change was as profound as previous historians have thought is an argument that I am here challenging. Since I'm speaking to San Franciscans, not for the first time, by the way, and I thank you for this invitation as for previous ones, I'll begin with a quote from one of your more eminent Irishmen, Father Peter York. This is a comment that York made in 1902 at an Irish fair in San Francisco. And he condemned, felt a great contempt indeed for those Irish who, as he put it, pose as Americans. They reminded him, he said, of a hippopotamus, which at a fancy dress ball got itself up as a swallow, or like the ostrich, which put its legs into the sleeves of the keeper's overcoat and pretended to be an elephant. I suppose I could have called the book Ostriches as Elephants, but there's an Irish word for these posers, and it's Shoneen, little Shawns, little John Bulls. There are Irish who act like Anglo-Americans, Irish who act like the British, Irish who act like the Americans, who forget who they were. And, Peter York, among many, felt a fine contempt for them. I acknowledge their existence. The number of Shoneens among the Irish immigrant and their descendants cannot be counted, nor did I try. I don't ignore them. As a matter of fact, I use them as a kind of object lesson in how not to be an erratic. They were simply not erratic. They made their way. They adjusted. They accommodated. Whether they surrendered, as Father York would have put it, and became what he called vinegar degenerates, I'll leave to others to decide. But the ones that I am focusing on were those who did not accommodate, who were not, they were transplanted for sure, but they did not cease to be what they had been. They continued to reveal certain of the habits, of the cultural habits of Irish Catholic people. Now, so to my title in the order presented. I borrowed the metaphor of the title from petrologists, geologists who study rocks. And I think one of the ways to explain that, it would be for me simply to read from page 2. It comes early. I was much taken by a comment made by John Gaddis, a very fine historian. It had nothing to do with the Irish, but Gaddis did point out that historians, like scientists and artists, have something in common. They depend on metaphor. Gaddis goes on, metaphors help historians think, and they have every reason to rely on them and use them unashamedly. After all, historians, need all the help they can get. I certainly would agree with that contention. But so, and without shame, and because it helps, I offer a metaphor of my own. I take mine not from science, I take it from science, but not from botany or from metallurgy, but from geology. Petrologists study the makeup of rocks, reading now from the book. They know the rock's characteristics, their culture, if you will. Petrologists develop taxonomies of rocks. They study where those of each sort are found in nature. They know what external forces can relocate and transform them over time. Principal among those external forces are glaciers. They move rocks from their native ground to places both distant and different. When the glaciers retreat, the rocks, many of them quite huge, others scarcely more than pebbles, stay where they were tumbled and left. These abandoned and orphaned ones are called glacial erratics. I think petrologists are to be praised. That in itself is an inspired metaphor. A few of these erratics sit alone, the only ones of their kind in the vicinity. Far more often, however, there's a collection of them, all from the same point of origin. They stand out because, though they are still demonstrably rocks, they're rocks of a different order and unlike the rocks all around them. Which leads to a key point, I think, my key point. They don't belong where they are. They are strangers. They are not native to the place. I could have called Irish Catholics America's contrarians, dissidents, dissenters, a people ill-fitted, mismatched, and misaligned. As a matter of fact, I call them all of those things at one time or another in the book. but I now have a better title name for them, one that can be made cultural or political or both. They were erratics, a people out of time and out of place. Even the Latin root of erratic applies. The word comes from arare, to wander, from which also comes errant, as in rowdy and badly behaved. That too sounded about right. All right, that explains, I hope, erratics, where I got the word and why I thought it fit. But why history's erratics? Um, this is a book about culture. It begins with a simple statement. It's a book about cultural divergence. So I needed to know, I needed to explain this, the importance of culture, meaning of it, what I meant by it, and its origins, where it comes from. I would like to add here, as I did in the book and with some emphasis, that mine is not a racialist or racist interpretation. I am not speaking of the Irish people as blooded. It is not their genetic makeup that is at issue. The source of their culture is what happened to them. I think that's the source of all people's culture. Call it historicism or whatever fancy word applies. But it is not a racial characteristic. That's not to say there is not an Irish race. There is. But we would be better served if it was simply called an Irish Catholic group. Group's a little bit too non-definitive, but it's called a race. I think it is a word that we must live with. But culture defines the values, the customs, the beliefs, the symbolic practices by which a people live. Here I will quote again from what I had written earlier. This is from Terry Eagleton, an Irish American who writes well of the Irish people. Cultural values are well and deeply entrenched. They exist in a semi-inchoate form. The vast repository of instincts, prejudices, pieties, sentiments, half-formed opinions, and spontaneous assumptions. I would add to all of that, and more. But certainly, they're not all good things. They are simply the things of a culture. Uh, but history is their source. So I have erratics, people out of time and out of place, a culture that is mismatched with that of self-consciously Protestant and capitalist America. Turning now to the subtitle, and these words also I thought fit. I'm dealing with Irish. They are my chosen erratics. Now, they're not the only ones to consider, but consider this. They were white, English speaking, showed a fondness for overcooked vegetables and an occasional spot of tea, and were entirely familiar, more familiar than they would have liked often, with Protestant Anglo-American ways. In some, they were the least likely of all of the erratics that I could have chosen. I don't see them that way. And I think of the book as a major reinterpretation. This is one of my reinterpretations. Historians have always thought of the Irish as being one of the more assimilable of America's immigrant groups, aside, of course, from the next word in my subtitle, Catholic. But we'll leave that for the moment. I don't think they were. Irish history is very, very different from American history. And so Irish culture is very different from American culture. The Irish were more fatalistic. They were more pessimistic. They were less effusive. They were less aggressive, less given to pioneering, let's put it. They were certainly more sociable, less individualistic. These were cultural traditions that arose out of their history. I've never understood entirely why there was such surprise that they would be clannish, or that they would show such little respect for the law, or that they would reveal certain bandit tendencies every now and again. Any people who had gone through what they had gone through would have behaved clannishly. They counted only on themselves because they could count on no one else. there was no one else who was going to care for them. The law had not treated them fairly, therefore they felt no real obligation to the law. That was true in the British Empire. It was true also in the Irish American worlds to which they had come. Let me offer a couple of examples, small examples. One of them, the first one, is not even in the book. I wish it were, but I hadn't found it in time. There was a temperance movement in Ireland. We're all familiar with it. Father Theobald Matthew had a lot of Irish took the pledge. They would not drink. It didn't work very well. It did had some success. Irish Catholic drinking habits uh, were revealingly less. They drank less than did English, Scot, or Welsh or Americans. But there was a temperance movement. Less frequently noted by historians is that there was also a temperance movement known as the Anti-Treating League. And this is a fascinating movement. I can't imagine any other people who would have thought of anything like this. Pledge was taken. You can drink whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted, and as much as you wanted. You could not, however, drink anything that was paid for, and provided by someone else, nor could you buy and treat someone else with drinks. In other words, you couldn't, as the Irish put it, go rounds. Um, Now, I suppose people might quarrel with this, but it's the sociability aspect of drink in Irish culture is such that it was assumed if they had to drink alone, they wouldn't drink. And if they were with someone, they were going to have to buy and be bought for. This was an economy based on reciprocity, favors done, favors returned. Um, Another story, this is in the book. Josiah Strong, a virulent anti Catholic Protestant bigot, once described an old Irish woman in New York who lived in extreme poverty. And a group of well meaning New Yorkers decided to find a place for her out west. Pennsylvania was probably what they had in mind. And they moved her out there thinking that she was bound to be, have better results. Uh, 6 months later, they found the old woman back in New York in the purlieus, as Josiah Strong called them, of Hell's Kitchen. When they asked why was she treated well in Pennsylvania, why did she come back? And her response, which Strong tried to depict in a phony Irish accent, was papals make better company than stumps. Um, Aside from the condescension, aside from the simple bigotry, which Strong, by the way, identified as a basic Irish Catholic philosophy. As a matter of fact, it probably was a basic Irish Catholic philosophy. People made better company than stumps. She preferred not penury or poverty uh, to its alternative, but she preferred being in company. Um, Another quick example, there's a story that Daniel Boone, the minute he could see the smoke of a neighbor's cabin, left to go farther west. That was that was sociopathic behavior to Irish. If they saw the smoke of a neighbor's cabin, they went to see if the neighbor would like a chat and perhaps a pint. If there's any help that he needed or she needed, any help that could be given. The idea of escaping social society was simply anathema to them. So these are cultural traditions. They arise from their history. Next word, Catholic. There's the rub. Here I want to quote, and it's a quote that was a key to me, and it remains such. One of America's, I think, great scholars is Robert Orsi. He's a historian. He's also a professor of religious studies at Northwestern. And his book, which I highly commend, History and Presence, is a major source for me. This quote comes from an article that Orsi wrote, and he recalls when he was a graduate student at Yale. And he was in the library and he encountered Sidney Ahlstrom, the senior historian of American religion. And I can imagine Orsi, the young graduate student, confronting Professor Ahlstrom. And he asked him a question. He said, "Do you think, Professor, there will ever be another anti-Catholic movement in America?" Ahlstrom's response was, "Young man, America is an anti-Catholic movement." Uh, and it was not in the Thomas Nast puerile racism of the Know Nothing movement in the years after it, but just in a general sense, America is an anti-Catholic movement. The Irish then, though white and English speaking, were of a different and false religion. Now, is that all that explains? No, their history is different. Seamus Heaney once said that the Irish were natural-born anthropologists. Americans were natural-born pioneers. Americans looked outward. Irish looked down. Americans looked forward. Irish looked backward. But add to that the Catholic, the religious, the sectarian question, and we have cultural divergence. Now, I use the word dissident, and here I want to thank specifically David Brundage, whom I hope is somewhere around and maybe even listening in. I'm in his debt because it was Brundage who was the first reader, actually, of the anonymous readers of the manuscript. I didn't know that until later, which is why David is identified as R1 in my acknowledgments. But David brought to my attention Raymond Williams and Dorothy Thompson, and from them I took the word dissident. It was, they were not radicals. I could have said that, and some were. And I talk about Irish Catholic radicals, but mostly I divide that Irish Catholic dissidents into three categories. They were the uncomprehending. The Irish Catholics simply couldn't figure it out, did not understand what was going on, and therefore tended to kind of ignore it. There were the comprehending but rebellious, who also ignored American values, and there were some radicals. There was an Irish contingent, as it was put, in American communism. And I talk about these Irish radicals, but the vast majority of my erratic and dissident Irish Catholics were simply those who did not understand entirely and agree mostly with the values of America, of a self-consciously Protestant, modern American capitalism. They fought then against all three parts of this triumvirate of sorts. They suffered as Irish, they suffered as Catholics, they suffered as working class, industrial working class in a capitalist economy. Next word, transformation. Again, I thought about this. I thought, well, maybe the transformation of American capitalism, or how about Irish Catholic challenge to American capitalism? Well, one of my sources, key sources, a fellow named Karl Polanyi, who wrote a book called The Great Transformation. I wanted to acknowledge that book by borrowing his word. So I called it, he's talking about the near global transformation to industrial capitalism. I'm talking about what happened to capitalism with the double movements that arose in response and in contrary to this transformation toward laissez-faire. Transformation seemed to me, it's a little bit stronger, I think, than it needed to be. But again, I wanted to acknowledge Polanyi, and I wanted to make the point, not that the Irish Catholics transformed American capitalism, but that they were a part of the double movement that indeed did transform it. Now, the double movement in America is simply explained. It's called the New Deal. It's called capitalism from 1930 till the Reagan Revolution and counter-revolution of 1971. I don't know what you call what's going on now. The that's bewildering to me, and not to mention ugly and mindless. All right, next word, capitalism. The transformation of American capitalism. I thought about using the word democracy, but then caught myself up in the contradiction between the two. There is a contradiction between capitalism and democracy. Uh, and the Irish Catholics were very, very quick to point it out. None more so than, say, Frank Walsh, whom I hope David Brundage will soon be completing a biography of. Uh, but capitalism is much more than an economic system. Certainly it is for me. It contains moral principles. It is a psychology, a philosophy, a culture. And so I used it. And finally, 1870 to 1930. I am not arguing that Irish Catholics are still erratic. Uh, this is not, I'm not making a case. Not trying to explain Steve Bannon, for example, who could. I'm not trying to explain that new Irish Catholic, J.D. Vance, other than perhaps to define him as more a medievalist than anything else. But I shut this story down in 1930. I'm not talking about Bing Crosby and Fitzgerald and the bells of St. Mary's. I'm not talking about when Irish Catholics ceased to be erratic, when they were almost adopted as America's favorite children. Um, Something happened clearly. There's a reason why the FBI ended up camped out at graduation at Fordham so that they could recruit Irish Catholic FBI agents. But my story is 1870 to 1930. Actually, I back it up a little bit before the Civil War, when they were erratics, a people out of time and out of place. Let me take a quick pause there before I get to some of the other major points I'm trying to make. Questions, comments? Anybody want to yell?
James, please. Unmute, Jim.
Hello, Dave. How are you?
Fine. Hi, Jim.
Good. This doesn't seem like the Dave Emmons I used to know. It seems like quite a impact on your interpretation of the Irish. Your two wonderful earlier books on Montana and the Irish in the West, I think could be characterized correctly as a brilliant regional studies. This seems to be national in scope. My question is, how did your recent studies impact your understanding of the Irish in the West? Has it?
Well, even the Butte book, one of the things that struck me when I started on Butte, one of the things that struck me when I moved to Montana and first visited Butte was that this place is not like every other place. I don't know whether it's because it's an industrial town, whether it's a Western town, or whether it's an overwhelmingly Irish town. It was actually more to the point. It was overwhelmingly Catholic. And as a lifelong papist myself, I recognize that there's a certain structure of feeling to Catholic communities, and Butte was one large Catholic community. I recognized about that. The erraticism that I found in Butte, the people out of time and out of place, was antecedent to my own erraticism. I also feel out of place and out of time. I made similar arguments, actually, Jim, in the Beyond the American Pale. There were aspects of Western American history that Irish Catholics simply did not embrace. They Some that they did, but I think they remained a people out of time and out of place. They remained dissident. Now, again, the dissidents did not assume radical form. Sometimes it did. William Z. Foster, for example, was a radical. Bill Dunn was a radical. Both were communists, as a matter of fact, self-avowed. I think both Larkin and Connolly, who are almost exclusively in the province of Irish historians, belong more in the province of Irish American historians. Both spent a lot of time here. I think they're qualified as Irish Americans. So I found always, even in the other two books, an erraticism. You're right though. I did carry it farther. I feel it more strongly now, and I don't think I'm revealing any historian secrets when I say that we are. I wrote this book during the Trump era. Uh, I found it, still find it loathsome. I don't know any other word to say it. Their erraticism is antecedent to my own. Their hostility, their cultural divergence is matched only by my own. And so I began finding in them some of the same feelings that I have now. That was particularly the case with Francis Patrick Walsh. If there's a hero to my book, it's Frank Walsh. Son of Irish immigrants, grew up in the Kerry Patch of St. Louis, Irish nationalist, labor lawyer, um, certainly the most fervent champion of industrial democracy, I think, in American history. Went way beyond in his chairmanship of the Industrial Commission, went way beyond where even Basil Manley left the accounts. Historians of American labor, Stromquist, Melvin Dubofsky, others have commented on Walsh's role without acknowledging, I think, sufficiently his Catholicism, his Irishness. So, all of a sudden, Frank Walsh and Bill Dunn, another Irish American communist, this time Butte related, Ed Boyce, same thing, born in Donegal, president of the Western Federation of Miners, wanted to raise a 25,000 man armed militia from Irish-led miners' unions. All of them brought their Irish Catholicism to bear on what were American social and political issues. All of them were both Irish nationalists and labor radicals, and they saw no conflict between the two. They were one because the other. All of them took semi-seriously, assuming they knew about it, the words of the fellow who's on the cover of the book. I like the fact that Connolly is the cover of the book. He's speaking in New York. I like that. It is a national story. Connolly was actually Scottish born, but of Irish descent and an Irish communist. But it was Connolly who said that in 1916, just a couple of months before he was executed, that the cause of Ireland is the cause of labor. The cause of labor is the cause of Ireland. They cannot be dissevered. He saw no reason even to think of dissevering them. Fight one, you fight the other. Fight one, you fight both. So, that's one of the critical points that I want to make. There were strikes.
That's good. I
accept
that as a full and complete answer. I think Tony's caveat at the start that the questions ought to be brief, and then perhaps the answers
should be briefer.
I think Tony and Dave could turn to other questions. Thanks. That's very satisfying. I have follow-ups to this, but other people need to participate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. And you have actually, Dave and I sort of prepared by common agreement a few other questions, but it seems that we've actually covered a number of them. But I will ask Dave, so the question was, why did you decide to write this now? And I'd say it seems that it's an important part of very important part of your, for lack of a better term, intellectual development. And so why this book? Why now?
Well, one reason was that I was getting older and I either write it now or it's not going to get written. But a lot of the research, I said the writing was done in the last, 10 years, but a lot of the research had been done earlier. The Butte book ended in 1925, but for reasons that are obvious to those who have read the Butte book. The Beyond the American Pale, I ended in 1910. I ended it because I had to. I had a lot of notes that went way beyond 1910. And, But the other reason was the Butte strike of 1917. I mean, that was a key to my book on the Butte Irish. This is a strike against copper during the war, but it was a strike was called by the Pierce Connolly Club, not by a union, but by an Irish nationalist organization. A strike. The strike, when it came, uh, the strike was a labor issue, but a strike had been called for what I would call Irish issues. And in that sense, Butte was very like Dublin 1916, like the Easter Rising, which had a nationalist aspect, obviously, an anti-imperial aspect, obviously. But Connolly is there. Even Pierce was far more radical in his politics, domestic politics, than has been acknowledged. He's sort of dismissed as a romantic poet, but I'm not sure that's entirely fair to him. So it's the combination of Irish nationalism and labor militancy that I wanted to lay on the land. And that combination is dissident, divergent, non-conforming, countercultural, call it whatever you want, erratic.
Thank you. And one of the other questions was, what are Americans of Irish descent to make of this history and these themes? And then you sort of answer, you've given an outline of the answer, which is, we're no longer erratics. So then but tracking further, just for students of history, how then would you populate, so the world of our grandparents and great-grandparents? So what were they reading? Who were they following? How would we understand? Because we know about the rebellious Irish Americans, but what you're saying is that it isn't simply, it's a core feature of their lives and their culture. For instance, and I'm being long-winded, I apologize, but when you populate, how would you populate that history? So for instance, Mother Jones. Mother Jones was an erratic. I think we can agree on that.
And she's part of a long list. Well, again, I go to the three categories, and I'm not very precise in defining them, but I refer to the non-comprehending, and these are simple Irish folk. That's what Father York called them. My Irish people, the simple Irish people, and they simply didn't get it. They came from a world where the economy was embedded in society, not the other way around. When social considerations, social relationships drove the economy, not the other way around. They came from a distributive economy, a reciprocal economy. Now they're in one driven by markets. They didn't get it. Now, that didn't make rebels of them. That certainly didn't make, they're not manning the barricades, but they lived quiet lives of non-comprehension. Now, the somewhat savvier second category would be those who said, we know what's going on. We comprehend it. Laissez-faire was the excuse that England gave for not feeding them when they were dying in the late 1840s, between 45 and 52. So the idea of laissez-faire, unregulated market-driven capitalism, was not well favored in the Irish American communities. Push the story forward to the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, when you've got numbers similar to those we have now, where 2% of the American population controls 60% of the American wealth. Make up whatever numbers or use whatever numbers you want. There's a discordance here. There's an asymmetry here. That was deeply offensive. It's deeply offensive to me now. It was sure as hell deeply offensive to them. How can you call yourself, they said of America, a democracy when you have this discordance in the distribution of wealth? This is to the point, by the way, this is another, I think, reinterpretation of mine. It's long been argued that what the rebels of 1916 wanted, what the Irish Republicans wanted, was Ireland to be America writ small. Well, there were some who wanted that, but those were the Shawnees. I dispute that entirely. sure, they like 1776 and the spirit of 1776. You're breaking from an English king. You're moving American colonies out of the British Empire. What could be better than that? They did not like 1876, and they certainly did not like 1900, nor were they particularly well favored in 1917 when the American Republic came, galloping into the defense of the British Empire. Those were my guys. Those were the focus. My Irish Catholic Erratics. There were others, and Jim Walsh has done a lot of very, very fine work on these others who made quick adjustments to American society, who were not treated as stepchildren, but were accorded almost full privilege. Sure, I acknowledge that. It's not that I'm not interested in them, I am, but I'm more interested in the percentage. What percentage? I don't know. I didn't even try. I think if you were to take all three of the categories, the quiet and non-comprehending, I'm going to claim 50% of Irish immigrants, Irish Catholic immigrants, and their descendants. The stories that were told generation to generation about what happened to our people. Stories didn't even have to be true. The history didn't have to be accurate. Question for Jim.
Jim's asking to interject.
You say this is about 50%. How impactful do you think that 50% was? I was struck by your original quote of Father Peter York. Wasn't this the lament of somebody trying to hold back the tide?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. He knew that he prefaced his remarks about ostriches and elephants and swallows with, "A man will remain what he is at the beginning," and he knew better. He knew that the simple Irish people in his parish were different from what they had been. And he knew that difference arose in part from what San Francisco had done to them. But he also knew that they were changing San Francisco. And what I'm trying to do is reverse the lens of immigration historians. They have spent all of this time trying to discern what Americans thought of immigrants. This is a book about what immigrants thought of America. And so I've reversed the lens. My emphasis is on them, on the Irish, and but they didn't speak for themselves very often. When they did speak, nobody was writing anything down. So we're dealing with ordinary people living everyday lives, and you've got to piece together their response to America using the kind of evidence that I tried to find.
Put your hand up longer, they don't see you.
Mr. Goggins.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was hoping you'd comment from your material here about Kremlin, Montana, the little town just outside of my hometown. I've only been in Kremlin about 10,000 times with the Morrissey brothers, my mother's family, and they ran the service station that we go by going east and west. So your reference to the Western historian Robert Athorn from Kremlin, explain that a little bit.
Actually, that wasn't my reference. Pat, I hadn't paid enough attention to what was read earlier by Tony from the back cover. Athorn, he died 20 years ago at least, but he had nothing to do with this book. He had nothing to do with the book I did on the Butte Irish. I didn't find that topic. It found me, but that's an entirely different story. One filled with chance circumstance more than anything else. But yeah, he was a Montanan. I was in his seminar when he was offered the job that Ross Toole took as the Hammond Professor of Western History at the University of Montana. And he explained to those of us in that seminar, this was, I hate to admit it, more than 60 years ago.
Uh,
He explained to us that he wasn't going back home, that he wasn't going from Boulder to Missoula. But yeah, he was yeah, he was very conscious of his Montana roots.
yeah, the reference in the material from ILHS was that you studied under the eminent Western historian from Kremlin, Montana, Robert Athorn.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Good
Uh,
going.
he went to graduate school in Minnesota. He once told me that he was the grandson. He studied with Ernest Osgood. And Osgood was a student of Frederick Jackson Turner, which made Athorn Turner's grandson, which made me, I guess, Turner's great grandson, a descent that I have never paid the slightest bit of attention to.
Great.
No, thank you, Pat. I have a question. Are there any other questions, please? Speak right up. Okay, Jim Mansborough, please.
Mute. A silly question. Is Kremlin, Montana named for Moscow?
You know, that's called the High Line. Pat can fill in the blanks here. It's the route of the Great Northern Railroad, J.J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad. There's all kinds of towns along that High Line, the Great Northern Route, that were named after European towns. Starts with Glasgow, Kremlin, Malta, Havre, La Havre.
Yeah, they named those little towns, like one of them is Galata, because there were some workers on that building the railroad, that part, who were from Turkey, Galata, outside of Istanbul. So all of those little towns are named, as you say, in connection with whoever the officials were with the railroad or the people working on the railroad. You pick the European towns like Havre.
It's sort of like, where did Bismarck get its name, or Moscow, Idaho? But yeah, Kremlin, I'm quite certain was. I didn't even know there was a Kremlin though when the Great Northern was being built. I have no answer to your question, Jim.
Don't worry. I'm just struck by a strain of Irish Catholic Americanism is very conservative. And they're not afraid to talk about godless commies.
Oh,
right. And so that's going to create a great schism in the aspirations of the labor movement's communist leanings. It's almost doomed from the get-go.
I quite agree. I do think that the Irish Catholic were not hopelessly reactionary. I also think that Rerum Novarum and Quadrissimo Anno ought to be reread by American labor historians, and that the Catholic Church's role on labor issues should be reevaluated as well. But I acknowledge that the Irish in particular were not, they didn't like socialism because that's state ownership of the means of production. Okay, who was the state? If they were in Ireland, the state was based in London. If they were in America, the state was based in places that had, I mean, even San Francisco, as Jim Welch knows well, the vigilante movement in San Francisco was openly anti-Catholic. So they confronted a state that was hostile to them. I argue in the book that it wasn't so much that they rejected socialism, that they didn't like socialism, they didn't like socialists. They didn't like their style. They didn't like the way they treated, what they said about Irish and what they said about the Catholic Church. They thought them condescending. They were. And their rejection may have had as much to do with the style of American socialists. They were much more favorably attracted to syndicalism, to a Soviet model, an IWW model, than they were the idea of a state ownership of production. Certainly, they are not going to give up their land. I mean, J.J. Keane is quite right in his play on turned into the movie, the Field.
The Field.
They are never going to give up the land. That is true of all peasants. I just read a great book by an English Irishman named Joyce, Patrick Joyce,
Yes.
on peasantry.
Hmm.
The all peasantries, not just the Irish, and it was a peasantry that immigrated. All of them rejected the idea of state ownership of farming land. So, it's a complicated story, but the old idea that the Irish Catholic conservatives blew up the American labor movement needs to be reevaluated. I'm not certain it isn't that the anti-Catholicism of American labor movement didn't blow it up. I mean, if you look at the numbers, it's incredible who worked the mines, who fought in the Western armies, who laid the Pat, here we go. Who laid the tracks for the railroad? Who did the crappy work of an industrializing America? It was immigrants. As one of David Brundtage's earlier works was Who Built America? They did the work, and the Irish were central among them. But they got very little, as John Kelleher put it one time. They got about as much credit for it as a draft horse.
Okay.
I'm looking for questions here.
So you're saying history is messy.
Oh, one of the people I quote, and is a medievalist by the name of Brad Gregory. Teaches in Notre Dame, and he says something in there that I think is quite true, that historians of American labor in the 20th century have to know something about the Reformation. Brad's big book is called The Unintended Reformation.
Hmm.
The Reformation brought about modern society. Modernity involves capitalism. The connections are there. If you want to know something about American labor, then you've got to take into account the multiracial, multi-ethnic nature of the American labor movement. But to dismiss the Irish Catholics within that movement, and they were dominant within that movement, to dismiss them as hopelessly reactionary is just, I think, ahistorical. I've got way too many Irish radicals, not just Foster and Mother Jones and Kate Kennedy but Bill Dunn and Ed Boyce and countless others. So there's plenty of room for the radicals in this book, but even more room for the category one, the quiet, non-comprehending.
I have a question. Thank you for that. How do I put this? How would you locate this book in the many volumes of interpretation of the Irish American experience in America? And there's some we might like and some we might vehemently dislike. I won't go into that. You may know what I'm referring to. How would you locate your work in the sort of intellectual tradition of Irish American studies?
Well, I would certainly want to move it beyond. Let's start with a book that I think there will be general agreement we don't like, How the Irish Became White.
Yeah,
Certainly, I would like to think that I pushed the story beyond that.
Yeah.
Simple to the point of simple-mindedness, not to mention, itself bigoted.
Yeah.
I've got a long chapter on E.P. Thompson his making of the British working class. And it's been argued that there's a couple of things that keep Thompson from being relevant to American labor history. One is that the English working class was not multiracial, multi-ethnic. Two, Thompson's story ends, the making of the English working class ends in 1832. And that's really before the American industrial working class was even in place. That's the lag in the industrial revolutions. Well, in fact, there's about a 20-page. It's offered up as a kind of addendum to the making of the English working class, and when Thompson deals with Irish Catholic immigrants into that working class. So, and he said that he refers to the hocus pocus of their medieval church. He calls it a nationalist religion. He talks about the Irish. So he's in the process, and then he says that their cultural values extended through 3 generations. Well, I did a quick math, I mean, that it means it extended the story way beyond 1832. In an article, Thompson quotes John Millington Synge and his writers, Playboy of the Western World. He talks about Irish in the English working class in the American and English labor movements as late as the 1890s. And he's still talking about the hocus pocus of their nationalist church. So I tried to change a lot of minds and redirect a lot of questions, but the basic ones are: were the Irish easily assimilated? I don't know. My answer is no. Number 2, were they hopelessly reactionary? My answer is no. Some were, not all. Should the immigration story be told almost entirely from the host society standpoint? I'd say no. It's really hard to get a handle on what immigrants think of America because they don't tell us. We know what Americans thought of Irish immigrants. We know what they thought of Irish Catholics. They drew enough cartoons and they wrote enough hateful literature that there's no disguising it. But what did the Irish Catholics think when they got here? Well, they're not writing it down very often, but when they do, and Bill Dunn sure did, and others did. So you got to try to judge it on the basis of what they did. There's a great book on Melrose, Iowa, called Holding Up the Hills. It was written by Leo Ward, Irishman, priest, taught at Notre Dame. There was an Irish Catholic community in Melrose, Iowa, farming community. And they got there, they were the second in line to get into this part of Iowa. And some Presbyterians from Indiana had gotten there first. When the Irish came in, the Indianans moved back to Indiana only after disinterring their dead. And from that point forward, the Irish of Melrose referred to non-Irish as Hoosiers. All they knew was that the ones that don't like us have gone back to Hoosier land. But they like to play baseball on Sundays, which was against Sabbatarian laws. And so they argued that they knew it was right in the sense that not wrong to play ball on Sunday. Well, making right is what is not wrong did not fit very well into the American legal code. Either civil or criminal. It didn't fit. So their habits, their culture did not fit. It doesn't have to manifest itself, that misfit. It does not have to manifest itself in the form of open rebellion. Just day-to-day accommodation. They accommodated. They did not assimilate. They accommodated. They articulated in the sense that your thigh bone articulates with your hip bone. What happened in the non-Irish world affected them. What happened in the Irish world affected the non-Irish world. But if you reverse the lens, which is the other thing that I tried to do, you get an entirely different view of the American immigration system and history. I would love to see somebody try to do the thing with every single immigrant group, past and current. I would like to have a direct challenge to which I tried to do, to the American notion that the immigrants all wanted to be in America. They couldn't wait to get the hell out of their homeland and into this new land. Well, I had too many Italian immigrants who told me quite differently. I had too many Irish immigrants who told me quite differently. They missed the homeland. They chose to leave, but they didn't want to leave. I think it's a great national conceit that all of the immigrants are lined up because they want to be in the home of in the home of the brave. What they wanted was a job. They wanted something to eat. And but the idea of leaving home, leaving family, leaving friends, leaving the places they knew, the Irish in particular, my God, they named everything. They named every hill, every rock, every creek, everything, the built environment, the natural environment. They all had names.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all papists know that when you give somebody something a name, you christen it. Mm-hmm. Christening is a sacred, is a sacrament. Mm-hmm. They were a part of this world. It was Chesterton who said of traditional societies or societies of a democracy of the dead. The Irish always asked, they didn't say, is this a good idea? Didn't go, have polling. All of the polling included a polling in the cemetery. Is this the right thing to do? And they're asking that of great uncles who died centuries earlier. Because I like all of that, because I think that's a sound and civilized way to go through life, I found these erratics a very, very attractive group of people to study.
Thank you. We have a question from Margaret McPeak. I believe it's you, Margaret. As a member of the Pearson Connolly Fife and Drum Band, I'm wondering if you could say a bit about the Pearson Connolly Club's role in the 1917 strike in Butte.
Oh my, that's a terrific question. Thank you for bringing it up. Pierce Connolly Club was formed in Butte in 1916 after, obviously, both Pierce and Connolly had been executed by the British after a kangaroo court. Conley Hayne came to Butte and said, we want Connolly circles, Connolly clubs. Went to all of the Irish towns. My wife is from Albany, New York, Irish family. That's where Conley Hayne started. He moved from Albany all the way to San Francisco and stopping off in Denver and obviously in Butte. He wanted only Connolly. He thought of Pierce as being the mystical poet. But in any event, Butte, being Butte, said, okay, we'll give you half of what you want. And they formed the Pierce Connolly. Then they called it the Irish Independence Club. They didn't call it the Irish Labor Club. But there was a huge population of unnaturalized Irish in Butte, working the mines. When the United States entered the war, the Wilson administration issued I think it was an executive order that all non-naturalized American people living in America had to register, not for the draft, they had to register so that everybody knew where they were. Well, the word registration, there were a lot of Finns in Butte. They were not terribly fond of the Russians. And the idea then that we're going to go to war on the side of the Russians, which would have been the case in April of 1917, that did not sit well with them. Very few of them spoke any English, and Bill Dunn and others of the Irish were able to exploit that. And they told a lot of the Finns, this is a draft registration. They're going to make you fight on the side of the Russians. They also made that case to the Irish. Now there were, but with the Irish, it was a very persuasive argument because they're not American citizens. They're still in the British Empire. They are subject to the British draft. So they called for the Pierce Connolly Club and called a strike. Dunn wrote the strike bulletin. That later became the name of his newspaper, the most radical newspaper in Western America, anywhere in America. So he called it the Butte Bulletin. Calls for a strike on the 6th of June. There's a lot of violence in Butte. Mass arrests are made. That's the 6th of June, 1917. On the 8th of June, 2 days later, there's that huge and tragic fire in the Speculator Mine that kills 168 men. Now, the Butte Miners Union is no longer in business. It destroyed itself. But there is a metal mine workers union, and it called a strike. All right, so far so good. The strike was not the Pierce Connolly. They called a strike, but the question must be posed. If there had not been a fire in the Spec, would established Irish miners have walked off the hill? Well, they never had. I mean, that was the most amazing story of part of the Butte story is that the Butte Miners Union was formed in 1878 until 1914 when it blew itself up, literally and figuratively. They had never gone out on strike. It was the most conservative union in America in terms of taking job action. But in 1917, that strike lasted until Christmas. It began on the 8th of June. It lasted until Christmas. You sustain a strike that long in the absence of any strike benefits to speak of. It's a wildcat strike too. It's not authorized by any established or recognized union. They kept it alive. All right, how? Well, the established Irish miners of Butte walked off the hill. The young guys in a Western mining town, a strike doesn't put young men on the picket line and puts them on the road. No more work in Butte. We're going to go to Pioche. We're going to go, we're going to go somewhere else. It's the old guys that maintain the picket line. And that's what turned that 1917 strike into, I think, one of the most important strikes in American history. But I call emphatic attention to the fact that a strike was called by the Pierce Connolly Club, not by the union. And it was called in protest of the war and the alien registration order that was a part of the Wilson administration's response to that war.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, unmute Pat. Pat, you're muted right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Another quick question and suggestion. Have you gone, Dave, to Ireland and spoken in person? Because if you haven't, I'd like to recommend that you do it forthwith. There's a terrific interest in Montana all over Ireland, but particularly, of course, in Cork and specific places. So have you been over there and spoken in person?
I was invited to speak in Letterkenny, County Donegal 6 years ago. So that was my last trip over. And there were a lot of Irish from Donegal. And so, their town, like Bonner is a Donegal name, Boyce is a Donegal name, Peoples is Donegal, McGowan. And they recognized all of these Butte names as I recognized them when they came up after the talk and introduced themselves. And you're right, I better go forthwith because I'm going to be 86 next month, Pat. And if I don't go pretty soon, I'm not going to get there.
You're just a kid. You're just a kid.
Yeah, no, I just got a new hip though, so I'm feeling young and frisky.
Okay.
Well done. Thank you, Pat. Another question would be, when a historian talks about the voices of the mass, the quiet masses, then I naturally question where your primary source material might come from. So reading the Monitor, for example, in San Francisco would tell you what's on Peter York's mind and what his appeal to the masses. Can you comment on that? Other primary sources?
Yes, and the Monitor is one of them. Yeah, there were parish newspapers. And those are sometimes ignored, but a lot of the parish newspapers, the American Catholic Church was run by Irish. And so even though this was a Catholic newspaper in my hometown of Denver and out of St. Catherine's Parish, it had county by county news of Ireland well into the 1940s and 50s. So there was that source. There were also Irish newspapers, the Irish World, the Gaelic American, and there were local Irish newspapers. In Butte, it was the Butte Independent. There was one in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Can't remember the name of it now, but obviously San Francisco had its. Denver had one, the Hibernian. There were the fraternal organizations. the AOH and the Clan na Gael. But mostly you try to, you read, like Finley Peter Dunn, Charlie Fanning was just in town to give a talk. And if you read Mr. Dooley and you allow the presumed trivial matters of literature and stories of Mr. Dooley talking to Hennessy and Hennessy saying to Dooley, I'm going to go to Alaska and get rich. And Dooley saying to Hennessy, what do you want to get rich for? It'll take 10 requiems to save your soul. Once you get rich, nobody will talk to you again. But there is a truth there, as there's a truth to the story of the Irish woman. Pimples make better company than stumps. That Irish philosophy that Josiah Strong mocked so contemptuously. So those are some of the primary stories. Jim Tully's book, name of which escapes me right now, is and some of the earlier history, Shannon's, is still got some useful, because he lived that world. Patrick Quinn's books, Flanagan's book.
Thomas Flanagan?
Yeah, who died not too long ago, but it's called Looking for Jimmy or something like that.
Oh, yeah, right.
William Kennedy's entire Albany, all of the Albany stories of my wife's hometown and the O'Connell machine that ran Albany. And of course Butte and San Francisco. You get magic cities, and I think Butte, San Francisco, Chicago, to a certain extent, New York. Those are the four capitals and of Irish America. And what happened there, we can know, that there is material, but a lot of it, older historians, the senior historians can get away with this more than, say, some young kid doing a PhD dissertation can. But older historians can get away with intuitive, with, E.P. Thompson's famous phrase, there was a working class structure of feeling to the working class neighborhoods of industrial Britain. Now, I can't imagine that some young guy looking for primary source material, what in the world is a working class structure of feeling? Unless you grew up in one. And because I did, I thought, yeah, I know what he's talking about. And because I'm senior, I can get away with it. I can say things like, yeah, I know what he's talking about. Yes, there is a working class structure of feeling to these worlds.
Thank you. We have another. Oh, go ahead.
Source material? No, not a lot.
But I think you've accrued knowledge and wisdom and insight over your many years, although you have many more years to come. But I did sense that this was a different kind of book for you.
Yeah, are you coming?
We had another question. What ideas do you have about the insidious racism that we see among many Irish Catholics, throughout our history, especially those in politics today? How can us modern erratics, people who consider ourselves erratics, maybe no longer Catholic but still Irish, be effective today?
You could borrow from an amazing group. David Bundy talks about them a lot. The Irish Progressive League. It was formed in New York in 1920. It consisted of some very, very well-placed Irish, including Liam Mellows from Ireland, one of the tragic victims of the Irish Civil War. The Irish Progressive League, you can also, and it strongly supported Black rights. It took seriously Voltaire's statement about you should be a citizen of the universe. And the Irish Progressive League argued, and Bruce Nelson, the late Bruce Nelson, another fine historian of Irish America, makes the case that when Marx distinguished between nationalism and internationalism, the labor movement was the international, and nationalist movements countered the labor movement. The Irish were trying to prove that wrong. And they did so to the extent that Lenin, at least, took very seriously. I mean, the Bolsheviks were the first to recognize the Irish Republic. There was, I call it an alliance between the Irish and the Soviets in 1917, 1918, all the way well into the 1920s. And so they spoke to the Irish Progressive League, spoke to black rights, women's rights, anti-imperialism, pacifism, Skeffington and Sheehy Skeffington both made visits. Skeffington, of course, by that time himself assassinated, but killed during the Rising. But there's let's just take, let's call it what it really, to an extent, it was, a clannishness. They were inclusive in the sense that if you were Irish, you were in. They were exclusive in the sense that if you were Irish, if you were not Irish, you were not. So there's something about the clan mentality that I find very, very attractive, the sense of community, of belonging. But the exclusive aspects of it are less attractive. And the Irish fought their way. Some went with Voltaire and the Irish Progressive League in defense of black rights. Marcus Garvey and the Harlem Renaissance strongly supported the Irish Republic. Mm-hmm. And Frank Walsh, again, the hero of my tale, Frank Walsh was a strong supporter of black rights. He championed labor, women, black rights, civil rights generally, and a Republican, an Irish Republic, a workers' republic. It wasn't just a republic; it was a workers' republic, and that word was frequently attached. Matter of fact, if you take that word off of it in Connolly's mind, and I think in Patrick Pearse's mind, it ceases to be Irish.
Mm-hmm. 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 Thank you. This is superb. Do we have other questions? Jim Hansbrough. Unmute, Jim.
Sorry, unmute. We cut you off mid-presentation for these questions. What else did you want to tell us?
You got more than and probably too much.
No, not at all, David. This is a wonderful presentation, and I'm glad to see your evolution beyond the two books that I'm so familiar with. Thank you very much. Most of my questions really have been answered in the Q&A, which has taken place since my previous question. I certainly appreciate all of this, but I'd like to get back to you again, perhaps on some other platform.
In Ireland, maybe.
Well,
both go.
Yeah. If your hip holds out and I hold out, we can either do that or in Montana or somewhere. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Me too.
Are those the winding up comments, or do we have other questions? We got 7 minutes. Yeah. All right. Well, you're going to leave it to me because I'm not sure that you bring up racism and labor, and it's interesting. I looked at a journal. My great grandfather was a railroad laborer in southwestern Ohio, Will Cull, and I saw his journal, and he talked about it was an articulate person competing with black people, black laborers. So Irish were competing with black laborers in the North as a challenge. And it's interesting. I mentioned this to an American studies professor, an African American friend, and he said, was it? Surely he used a certain word. I said, no, it wasn't. He wasn't talking that way. He was simply saying Now I have to, I'm working on the railroad. Now I have to compete with black workers. And so there's this whole world of the Irish and the blacks at some point in our history being on a similar um, plane. Can you sort of go into that thicket a little bit, please?
Well, again, I worked really in the book. I wanted to make this point very, very emphatic that do I talk about the nativism, the anti-Catholicism, the anti-Irish sentiments of many in Protestant America? You bet. Absolutely. Do I liken it in any way to the prejudice against Black Americans? No, I do not. I reject any suggestion
Right.
that they were even remotely related. I did, however, this is from Beyond the American Pale, David Roediger's book, The Wages of Whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
I refer to the wages of Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
When those Irish, when you've got no Irish need apply signs, that did not apply to Irish Protestants. It did not apply to the Protestant immigrants from Ireland. There was an implied Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got wages of Protestantism. One of the things that makes Butte so unique is that the Irish ran the Anaconda Company. There were even rumors that the job notices were posted in the Irish language, so nobody else could read them. So what you had in Butte was kind of the wages of Irishness. You were privileged. You were granted special favors. It's a very, very complicated story, particularly Black and Irish. But the best of them, the Irish Progressive League, as Irish, spoke out strongly. They were formed actually during a mayor's race, and there was an Irish Catholic running for mayor of New York against an American Jew by the name of Morris Hillquist. And the Irish Progressive League was formed in support of Hillquist's candidacy. Mm-hmm. Then the support given by Marcus Garvey. Frank Walsh was the president of the Friends of Indian Freedom, not Native American people, but the East Indian people in their anti-imperial war against the British Empire. Even the time you move toward anti-imperialism, by the way, I think, Tony, you're getting very close to race, because so many of the imperial colonies were in areas, South Africa comes immediately to mind. So to be anti-imperial was, to a certain extent, to be on the side of civil rights, Black rights, the rights of people of color. So in that regard, the Irish record is mixed. The Irish Catholic record is mixed. The record of the Catholic Church generally is very mixed. But I don't think the record is any worse than that of any other component of white America.
Yeah. Thank you. Patrick, I think you had another question. Pat, you want to unmute, please?
Yes, you're inspiring, all of you. I would like you to comment a bit on the Irish and the Chinese. Here in California, we've done an awful lot of reconciliation because of the hard feelings that were felt in Irish, particularly campaigning for Chinese must go and the Chinese Exclusion Act and all of that. And we've made some great progress, and I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, you're talking, of course, about Dennis Carney and the Chinese must go. The anti-Chinese aspects of. I think that was more a labor issue than it was an Irish issue. More a labor issue than it was a race issue. But I defer to those of you who know so much more about it. The idea of excluding on the basis of skill was something that labor took seriously. You cannot have this job if you can't do the job. But that applied only to the trades. When you get into industrial labor, then the power to exclude does not include is not skill-based. Once the underground mines went to pneumatic drills, anybody big enough and strong enough to lift one of those drills and dumb enough to go 3,000 feet underground with it became, quote, a miner. Well, now since the word for it among the labor historians is de-skilling. So you have all of these jobs that have been de-skilled, which leaves labor with absolutely no leverage. If you need a skilled carpenter, then the skilled carpenter will command a decent wage. If you're only looking for guys who can lift heavy objects, then there's no power to exclude except race. And I mean, this certainly is not by way of commending, but it is a partial explanation of, in 1941, the Butte Miners Union, which had self-destructed in 1914, it come back to life in 1934, the founding member of the CIO. So it was a very left-wing union led by a lot of communists, and there were a lot of communists in the CIO. In 1941, there was a real shortage in the mines of Butte, particularly 41, 42, particularly after the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, because you got all of these guys going, it was actually safer to fight on the Western Front in World War II than it was to work the mines. But so the government needs copper. So they sent, first of all, they sent women to Anaconda to work in the smelter. Then they decided they're not going to put women in the mines. So they sent blacks from the American South to Butte. And the Butte Miners Union said, absolutely no way. We will not work with black men. And so they threatened to strike, which in 1942 was not a very good thing to be doing, given the need for copper. The CIO had to send a lot of their big shots. It was a covered story in Time magazine, by the way. Yeah, it's a moment of shame in the history of Butte. But it happened. But it's really, well, is it a labor issue or is it simple racism? I could dodge the question by saying a little of each or a lot of each. Jim's got a hand up.
Yeah, I would like to take this opportunity to really commend Pat Goggins for the work he's done in trying to reconcile this issue in San Francisco and California and throughout the West. He's been leading it for a goodly number of years. The earliest I can remember is the celebration of the drive-in of the Golden Spike in Utah, the 100-year anniversary, when I think he was the only Irishman that went on the train ride with the Chinese Historical Society to that event. And he's been on it ever since. For most of the time, the Irish anti-Chinese reality was below the skyline of history. Most of us either didn't know about it or recognized its existence and didn't develop it. I plead guilty there in my early career. While I mentioned it in my PhD thesis on Peter York, I never developed that theme. Wiggling away from this anti-Chinese behavior is, I think, not possible. Dennis Carney is correctly characterized with the Chinese must go. He was the face of anti-Asian racism of the Irish and the labor movement. Peter York, who gets positive quotes frequently, I've even done it myself, was the face of Irish racism and religion. He felt the Chinese were okay as long as their numbers could be controlled and they would be a servile race amidst us. Then James Duval Phelan, the mayor of San Francisco and U.S. senator, was more educated and more sophisticated on the issue. He proclaimed that California should remain a homogeneous commonwealth. Okay. Well, I guess I got it between the eyes when I read Erica Lee's book on the xenophobia that dealt with the feeling. This stuff is horrendous. Pat, thank you.
Yes, I joined, and I joined him, and Pat has done and would have done wonderful work. In this regard, though, I'm becoming an apologist for Irish Catholics. The Rock Springs massacre, 28 Chinese killed in Rock Springs, Wyoming. And I did check to get the population figures for that county in Wyoming. I can't even think of the name of the county right now, but it's in beyond the American Pale. And the Irish quotient in that Idaho county was minuscule. Rock Springs, of course, is in far southwestern Wyoming. There were probably, well, I'm not even going to guess at who they were. I did not do an analysis. I didn't go to the manuscript census and try to figure out. No one was ever tried for the murder of the 28 Chinese. It was, it's one of the more horrific events in American labor history, but certainly the statistics would suggest that the Irish were not uniquely involved in this. In the way
that's not saying a hell of a lot.
No, it's not. That's a low bar. I agree. But there were very, very few Irish in, I can't remember the name of that county, in that Wyoming county, in the Rock Springs area.
Well, turning that around, these Californians that I just mentioned, Dennis Carney, Peter York, and James Duval Phelan, they never killed anybody physically. They just abused a race, publicly and systemically.
Oh, it's Irish American record in the area of racial tolerance is horrible. Although again, it's mixed. There were also Irish like Mickey McGowan who wrote that they treat the Indians, the Native American people, the same way in America that the Brits treat us in Ireland. And he made that connection directly, and he made it as an Irishman, reflecting on racial prejudice, racial and cultural prejudice. There were others like McGowan who made that same point. But for every McGowan, there was a Thomas Francis Marr who fell off the boat at Fort Benton while he was waiting for a shipment of guns so he could go after the Blackfeet. There was Gibbon, who was at the little big, at the Big Hole battlefield. The number, God, how many forts are there in the West, Pat, named after Fort Keogh, and on and on. Custer's, take a look at the casualty list at the Little Bighorn, and it reads like a gathering of the Irish clans. But the immigrants always did the crappy work of any society. They built the railroads, they mined the ores, and they carried the guns.
Yeah. So we're about out of time. I think we'll take this opportunity to close. I want to thank Dave Emmons for an absolutely superb talk today, and I know that we could have gone on for another hour and a half. I hope that we'll see you again soon. Please, everyone, buy the book. It's on Amazon.
Overpriced.
It's a wonderful book, and I think we'd all benefit from reading it. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks to everybody for.
All right. See you all later.
Thank you so much. It was great.
It was terrific.
Best to everybody.
Terrific.